Welcome back to the Zero podcast, or welcome to the Zero Powerlifting podcast if this is your first time. Today I'm going to talk to you about stability. I'm going to try and take what is a relatively complex topic and demystify it, make it a little bit less complex. It's probably made out to be more complex than it needs to be a lot of the time, and that is purely because the definition of what stability is not readily agreed upon. So if you have a different definition of what stability is to me, and we're having a conversation about this concept, we're having a different conversation. So it's really hard to find any solidarity if the definition is different. So when you read information on stability, when you see exercises designed to impact stability for a lifter or otherwise, if the person who's talking about stability has a different definition to you, then the lines are going to get blurred. And so the first part we need to start this conversation with is what a definition of stability is. Where I believe a lot of lifters and coaches go wrong when it comes to stability is thinking that stability is a trainable concept. As a singular, the concept of stability is not a trainable concept. Rather, what we should do is look at stability as an umbrella term that covers a few trainable concepts. Because if you just Google the definition of stability and find a definition that matches up to what you visualize when you see a lifter. So for example, stability is the ability to resist force. It's a basic definition of what that word actually means. We can draw conclusions to what that means for us. So the ability to resist force, we think, okay, well, let's think of basic human movement, locomotion, walking, the gait cycle. When we're walking, there are times where we are on one leg. We're balancing our entire body on one leg. Our ability to stabilize is our ability to resist the force of our body wanting to shoot us out to the side. We're stabilizing against those external forces of just gravity. Further to that, you could say, well, if I shove someone while they're walking and they resist that force and don't just fall over, they've stabilized against that external force. Then we can apply that into a lifting context. We can think stability is the ability to resist force. Compared to walking, lifting is a very stable environment. When you're doing a squat, you've got both feet on the ground, you've got a wide base of support, you've got the stability of the bar. The bar is providing a stabilizing concept. When we look at stability within the movement, the stability that we're talking about is your ability to resist the force of going into positions that you don't want to go in. In a squat, that might mean knees not caving in. In a squat, that might mean back not rounding. Those kind of things are what we're talking when we talk about stability. And so when we look at it like that, then we can break it down to trainable concepts. And when we do break it down to trainable concepts, there's not just one pure thing. There's not stability on its own. There are several concepts that fall under this umbrella. The way that I teach it through Zero, the way that we conceptualize this umbrella term of stability is by encompassing two major training concepts. One is motor control, that is the ability to tell your body to get into a particular position or having the ability to access that position. And the other is strength. How can we scale the access and the ability to get into that position as the load increases? CJ, damn! Not the watching the videos in the background. It's all good. Anyway, keep that in the video. People need to know how this stuff actually happens. So those two concepts are really easy to understand. Getting into position is easy to understand. That's going to encompass cueing. That's going to encompass some low-level drills. And strength is very easy for us to understand, especially as strength athletes and strength coaches. We just scale this up through movement. So when we look at it like that, it demystifies the concept a little bit. Then we can sort of wrap our head around some other terms, for example, flexibility and mobility. Mobility is literally just the ability to go from point A to point B. It doesn't really belong in our vocabulary too much as strength coaches because it is so ambiguous in this world. Like when you look at the sports science, you're going to have a hard time finding that word in the sports science. Flexibility is a little bit easier to understand. It's just basically the passive range of a joint. A lot of people will refer to mobility as like the active range of a joint, but again, that's not a complete way of viewing this. The active range of a joint is determined by your ability to access that position and your flexibility, the ability for the joint to go through that range. So that's just motor control and flexibility together. That's two concepts that we already have definitions for. So coming back to the heart of this discussion, stability, motor control, scaling through strength. Where it gets really messy is applying it to the context of lifting. The reason it gets messy, or I would say there's two major reasons it gets messy. Reason number one, if you Google hip stability, shoulder stability, core stability, you are going to get endless exercises and drills and concepts. And it's a far reach or a far stretch to assume that improving the stability of a joint improves the stability of a movement. So what I mean by that is like that you might find a perfect exercise for hip stability for a golfer, for a rugby player. It might not have any great deal of benefit for someone lifting in a particular position under maximal loads. And so when we talk about stability, there is a high degree of specificity that has to be applied for it to carry over into the main lift. To help visualize this concept a little bit deeper, think of it like this. A classic core stability exercise that people gravitate towards is something like a bird dog or a dead bug. If this was a great core stability exercise for squatting, you have to ask yourself the question, who's going to win a fight against the core? A 300 kilo squat or a dead bug? It's like the 300 kilo squat is going to win every time. That is, your ability to get really good at dead bugs isn't going to mean shit when you put that load on your back. That's not to discount that exercise, but it's about understanding where it fits in this sort of training continuum. And so if we're going to wrap our head around the stability concept, we need to understand what we're trying to do with it. The second big thing where people go wrong here is an overemphasis on what muscles do rather than an emphasis on what we want our positions to be when we're performing a particular lift. Classic example of this that infiltrated the industry hard 5-6 years ago is this overemphasis on something like glute med. And it's got a great logical pathway of arriving here. So people watch someone do a squat. They see a knee cave in. They're like, we don't want the knees to cave in. That's representative of power leaking from the system or deep stabilization of the hips, whatever you want to call it, however you want to view it, right? They see the knee caving in. They perceive it's bad. They're like, what is the movement that's happening when the knee caves in? Internal rotation, adduction. So they're like, okay, well, obviously the muscle that's responsible for the opposite of that is weak. What's responsible for something like external rotation, abduction? Okay, well, we find the glute med. That does both of those things. It would make sense then for us to strengthen that muscle. How do we strengthen that muscle? Let's find out. Okay, we do monster walks, we do clamshells, we do all of these like other exercises to strengthen this particular muscle. We miss the point in doing so because we're focusing on what the muscle does to that joint rather than how the muscle contributes to that position. And so the position should be the focus, not the muscle. Why? Because you can't measure how much of that muscle's ability to do its role in terms of how it acts upon the joint is failing or succeeding in the movement itself. You can measure the movement itself and you can train and regress and progress the movement itself, the position itself. That's how stability training should work. And so this is where we sort of start to simplify everything. This is how we should look at stability training. If we look at stability now as this concept of controlling a position and scaling strength in that position, we then start from the top down and we regress until we need to get to the very bottom. So we look at something, again, like a squat. We have an idea of what the hips want to do, what the pelvis wants to do, the upper back, the core, the major areas that we're trying to control in a squat. We see them breaking down in the squat. We think we need to work on stability. We need to, find control or strength. Your first point of call should be doing that in the movement itself. That is cueing the movement, regressing the movement, adding a modulated intensity, making it hard by reducing the weight, but adding a tempo, adding a pause, etc. You need to be able to do it in the movement itself because that's what you're trying to achieve. In other words, you identify the breakdown in the squat, you trying to target this in, say, a split squat or a very low level drill isn't going to meet the specificity demands when it comes to the position itself and the load on the bar. You need to tick off both of those boxes. You may not be able to do that. You might not just be able to think your way out of it. If it was as simple as that, then everyone could fix their squat straight away with the right set of cues. But that's where we start, and that's where our end goal is. We have to at least be trying to access those positions. We need to be actively trying to do that as best we can in our working sets. Then we need to be using our regressions of these exercises to target this specifically. And so the load in these regressions should be determined by your ability to control those positions. So if you just do a tempo squat and you work out a percentage of your main squat and you can't perform the tempo squat in the way that you want to perform the main squat, all you're doing is reinforcing the same breakdowns. And the more that you reinforce the same breakdowns, the harder it is going to be to change into the shape that you want to change into. So the load in these regressions should be determined by the performance. Then what we can do is regress, where we try and keep the load high, but try and target the particular area that we are trying to fix. So for example, how can we target the hips in a squat, keeping the load high without the demands of, say, the upper back and the core and the bracing? We can do something like a leg press. So we jump on a leg press, we focus on what the hips are doing. They're still going through the full range. They're still, engaging the way that we can, or the way that we want to in the squat. We can still cue the same thing. Then we can regress from there. It's a complicated subject, but if we can understand the concept of what we're trying to achieve in the lift, the concept of what we're trying to change in the lift, the position we're trying to get into, the range that we're trying to control that joint through, once we can understand that, the actual process of correcting it becomes very, very simple. We try and correct it in the main lift with the cueing. We regress slowly, trying to stay as close to the movements as possible, as close as specific as possible, both in terms of load and in terms of movement. And then we get smaller and smaller and smaller in terms of targeting the breakdown directly. That gets a bit complicated when we start talking about all the various things that can break down. However, happy to talk about this more. If you have any specific questions, you want to know more on the subject, feel free to reach out. Always love to have conversations around this stuff. Hope you enjoyed that episode. If you have any questions on stability, training, coaching, anything, flick us a message. We'll help you out. Enjoy. Goodbye.